People don't fall from grace in one moment. They drift there, one small choice at a time. The rain came down in a steady gray sheet, turning the glass facade of Blake Industries into a mirror of blurred lights and moving shadows. And Olivia Hayes adjusted the sleeve of her tailored coat as she stepped out onto the polished stone entrance, her heels clicking with sharp precision against the ground. Each step measured, controlled, intentional, the kind of rhythm that told the world she belonged exactly where she stood, 29 years old, head of HR at one of the fastest-growing tech firms in New York, a woman who had built herself from nothing into someone people didn't question, didn't overlook, didn't pity, and she intended to keep it that way because she knew what it felt like to be on the other side of that glass, cold, invisible, unwanted, and she had sworn years ago she would never be that person again, not for anyone, not for anything, and especially not today. Not when she had a board review in less than 30 minutes and a dozen employees depending on her decisions. But then she saw him, just beneath the edge of the building's overhang, a man hunched against the rain, his clothes worn thin, darkened by water, his hair clinging to his forehead, his hands trembling slightly as he tried to keep himself covered with what little shelter the narrow ledge provided. And for a fraction of a second, something flickered behind Olivia's eyes, something old, something she had buried deep beneath layers of discipline and ambition, but it vanished just as quickly as it came, replaced by the tight, controlled expression she wore like armor, because vulnerability had no place here, not in front of clients, not in front of her colleagues, not in front of the image she had fought so hard to build. And she slowed her steps just enough to glance toward the security desk, her voice calm, firm, almost effortless as she said, "Can someone handle that?" Nodding slightly toward the man without fully looking at him, as if even acknowledging him directly would blur a line she refused to cross. The guard hesitated for a moment, glancing between Olivia and the man, but Olivia didn't wait. She continued walking, the faint scent of rain and city air trailing behind her as the sound of footsteps approached the man, a quiet exchange lost beneath the hum of traffic and falling water. And she told herself it was necessary, that this was how things worked, that professionalism meant maintaining standards, maintaining order, maintaining distance, because if you let one exception in, everything began to unravel. And she could not afford unraveling, not now, not ever, but as she reached the revolving doors and stepped inside, the warmth of the lobby wrapping around her, she caught her reflection in the polished marble, perfect posture, composed expression, not a single trace of hesitation. And yet, somewhere deep beneath that surface, there was a question she refused to answer, a whisper she refused to hear. And outside, just beyond the glass, the man shifted slightly, stepping back into the rain as the guard gestured him away, his eyes lifting for a brief second. Not angry, not pleading, just observing, as if he were seeing more than what stood in front of him, as if he were waiting for something, or perhaps measuring something. And then he turned, disappearing into the gray blur of the city, leaving nothing behind but the echo of a moment that, to Olivia, meant nothing at all, or at least, that's what she believed. The lobby smelled faintly of polished stone and fresh coffee, the kind of quiet luxury that made people lower their voices without being told. And Olivia Hayes moved through it with the same steady rhythm she had carried all morning, her mind already sorting through schedules, performance reports, and the names of employees whose futures rested in the decisions she would make before the day was over, because that was her job, to evaluate, to decide, to keep the machine running without hesitation. And she reminded herself of that as she stepped into the elevator, pressing the button for the 32nd floor, watching the doors close on the reflection of a woman who looked entirely in control, entirely unbothered. And yet as the elevator began its smooth ascent, her thoughts flickered, uninvited, back to the image outside, the man in the rain, the way his shoulders had curled inward, the way his hands had trembled. And she exhaled quietly, almost annoyed with herself, because she did not have time for distractions, not today, not when the quarterly review meeting would determine restructuring across multiple departments. And as the elevator chimed and opened, she stepped into the bright, open office space where conversations softened the moment she passed, where people straightened slightly, aware of her presence, aware of what she represented. and she nodded briefly to a few employees before heading straight to her office. Glass walls, clean desk, everything in its place, everything exactly how she needed it to be, because control was not just a preference, it was survival. And she sat down, opening her laptop, diving into files, metrics, numbers that told stories without emotion, stories she could trust, stories that did not blur or hesitate, unlike people, unlike memories. And for a while, the rhythm of work pulled her back into focus until a soft knock interrupted her, and her assistant, Daniel, stepped in, holding a folder, his expression careful. "We had a small situation downstairs earlier," he said, placing the folder on her desk. "Security logged it because it involved a guest complaint." Olivia did not look up immediately, her fingers still moving across the keyboard as she replied, "Handled?" Daniel hesitated just a fraction. "Yes, but the man they removed has been seen around the building the past few days." That made her pause, just for a second, her gaze lifting, sharp, assessing, and, she asked, her tone neutral, controlled. Daniel shifted slightly. "Some employees mentioned he has been watching the entrance, not causing trouble. Just there." Olivia leaned back slightly in her chair, her expression unreadable, because part of her wanted to dismiss it, to categorize it as irrelevant. But another part, quieter, less convenient, remembered the way the man had looked, not desperate, not aggressive, just observant, and that unsettled her more than it should have. "Make sure security keeps an eye on it," she said finally, closing the folder without opening it. "We cannot have disruptions, especially this week." Daniel nodded and left, and the door clicked softly behind him, leaving Olivia alone again in the quiet hum of her office. And for a moment, she stared at the reflection in the glass wall across from her, the faint outline of the city beyond it, gray clouds still hanging low, and she reached for her coffee, taking a small sip, only to realize it had gone cold, and she frowned slightly, setting it back down, her mind already shifting forward again. Because there was no room for hesitation, no room for second-guessing, and yet as the hours passed, moving from meeting to meeting, voice steady, decisions firm, there was a subtle tension she could not quite shake, like a thread pulled just slightly out of place. And when she finally stepped out of the building later that evening, the rain had stopped, the air cool and sharp, the city lights reflecting off damp pavement. And for reasons she did not fully understand, her eyes moved instinctively to the spot beneath the overhang where the man had been that morning. But it was empty now, nothing there but the faint echo of a presence that should not have mattered, and she told herself again that it did not, that it was nothing, just another passing moment in a city full of them. But as she turned to leave, there was a lingering thought she could not quite silence, a quiet question that followed her into the night, one she still refused to answer. The next morning arrived with a crisp chill in the air, the kind that made the city feel sharper, more awake, and Olivia Hayes walked faster than usual, her heels striking the sidewalk with quiet determination as she approached Blake Industries, her mind already running through the day ahead, meetings stacked back to back, decisions waiting to be made. And yet beneath that familiar rhythm, there was something else, something she could not quite name, a subtle pull that made her glance up before she reached the entrance, and there he was again, standing just beyond the edge of the building's overhang. No rain this time, just the pale morning light catching on the worn fabric of his jacket, his posture straighter than she remembered, as if he had been waiting, not idly, but intentionally. And Olivia slowed, just slightly, her gaze flicking toward him before she could stop herself, and for a brief second, their eyes met, his steady, calm, almost unsettling in its quiet awareness, and she felt that same flicker from the day before, that brief, unwanted echo of something she had long buried. But this time, it lingered a fraction longer, enough for her to notice the details she had ignored before, the way he held himself, not hunched, in defeat but balanced, the way his eyes moved, observant, taking in everything without urgency, and it did not match the image she had already decided he belonged to. And that realization irritated her more than anything else, because it meant she might have misjudged, and Olivia Hayes did not misjudge, not in her world, not where precision mattered. And yet as she reached for the door, his voice came, low, steady, not pleading, not aggressive, just direct. "Excuse me." And she paused, just enough to acknowledge it without fully turning, her hand still resting on the cold metal handle. "I am not asking for money," he continued, and there was something in the way he said it, measured, deliberate, that made her glance back despite herself. "Just a moment of your time." Olivia exhaled softly, the impatience already rising, because time was the one thing she did not give freely, not to strangers, not to interruptions, and yet something held her there, a hesitation she could not immediately justify. "You should not be here," she said finally, her tone calm but firm, the same tone she used in conference rooms when drawing clear boundaries. "This is private property." He nodded slightly, as if he had expected that response, as if it confirmed something rather than surprised him. "And you believe that makes you better than the people outside it?" The question was simple, almost casual, but it landed with a weight she did not anticipate, and Olivia felt her expression tighten, her posture straightening instinctively. "It has nothing to do with better," she replied, her voice sharpening just slightly. "It has to do with responsibility, with standards, with people earning their place." And even as she said it, the words felt rehearsed, familiar, something she had repeated to herself for years, something that had carried her from small apartments and overdue bills to glass offices and executive meetings, and she held on to that certainty, because it had always worked, it had always protected her. And the man studied her for a moment, his gaze unwavering, not challenging, not judging, just taking in what she revealed without saying more, and then he gave a small nod. Almost thoughtful. "Interesting," he said quietly, as if filing the answer away. And for a second, Olivia felt something shift, a strange discomfort at being observed in that way, not as an authority, not as a decision-maker, but simply as a person being understood, and she did not like it, not at all. "Security will be here soon," she added, turning back toward the door, reclaiming the distance she needed. "You should go." There was no anger in her voice, just finality, and this time, she did not wait for a response, stepping inside as the doors closed behind her, cutting off the cool morning air, the noise of the street, and whatever else lingered in that brief exchange. But as she moved through the lobby, the echo of his question followed her, quiet, persistent, threading through her thoughts in a way she could not easily dismiss, because for the first time in a long while, something had not fit neatly into the structure she relied on. Something had slipped past her control, and she could not decide if that made her uneasy or curious. By midday, the building felt different, not louder, not busier, but tighter somehow, as if an invisible thread had been pulled through every department, drawing everything into sharper alignment. And Olivia Hayes noticed it the moment she stepped out of her third meeting. The usual casual chatter in the hallways replaced with quieter conversations, employees glancing at their phones more often, managers moving with a subtle urgency that had not been there the day before, and she did not need to ask why, because she had already seen the internal memo that morning, brief, direct, impossible to ignore. Executive leadership would be conducting a full operational audit, effective immediately, no notice, no preparation window. And although the message did not include a name, it did not need to, because everyone in the company knew what that meant. The CEO was stepping in personally, and Olivia walked back toward her office with a composed expression, her posture steady, her pace unchanged, because on the surface, this was exactly the kind of situation she was built for: structure under pressure, clarity under scrutiny. She had always thrived in environments where others hesitated, and yet as she reached her desk and sat down, opening her laptop, there was a faint echo in her mind, something from earlier that morning, a question that had not settled the way it should have, and she pushed it aside, focusing instead on the data in front of her: employee performance metrics, retention rates, disciplinary records, everything that defined her department, everything she controlled, because control meant certainty, and certainty meant safety, and she needed both now more than ever. But just as she began organizing her notes, another message appeared on her screen. This one marked high priority: a request for all department heads to attend an emergency briefing at 4 o'clock in the main conference hall. Mandatory attendance, no exceptions, and Olivia leaned back slightly in her chair, her fingers still resting on the keyboard as she read it again, slower this time, because there was something about the timing that felt deliberate, precise, as if someone had been watching, waiting, deciding exactly when to step in. And for a moment, her mind drifted, uninvited, to the man outside. The way he had looked at her, not like a stranger asking for help, not like someone out of place, but like someone measuring something deeper, and she shook the thought away, almost sharply, because it made no sense. It could not make sense. And she did not allow herself to build narratives out of coincidence, not when facts were still unfolding. And the rest of the afternoon passed in a controlled blur. Meetings concluded, notes finalized, her voice steady as she reassured her team, outlining expectations, reinforcing standards. Because if there was one thing Olivia Hayes understood, it was how to maintain order when uncertainty crept in. And yet, even as she spoke, even as she moved through each task with practiced precision, there was a quiet tension beneath it all, like something just out of view, something waiting to be revealed. And when the clock finally approached 4, she stood, smoothing the front of her blazer, gathering her tablet and notes, and stepped out of her office, joining the flow of executives, heading toward the main conference hall, the air heavier now, anticipation layered beneath professionalism. And as she walked, her reflection appeared briefly in the glass panels along the corridor, composed, confident, exactly as it should be. But her eyes held something new, something she could not quite define. And as she entered the conference hall, taking her place among the other department heads, the room settling into a quiet expectancy, her gaze shifted, almost instinctively, toward the entrance, and for a split second, she felt it again, that subtle, unsettling awareness, as if the answer to a question she had not fully asked was about to step through those doors, and she did not yet know whether she was ready for what it might reveal. The room fell into a silence so complete it almost felt staged, as if every breath, every shift of fabric, every glance had been rehearsed for this exact moment. And Olivia Hayes sat perfectly still at the long conference table, her tablet resting untouched in front of her, her gaze fixed on the closed doors at the far end of the room. Because something in the air had changed, something that went beyond a routine executive audit, something that pressed quietly against her instincts. And then the doors opened, not abruptly, not dramatically, just a smooth, controlled motion, and a man stepped inside, dressed in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, his posture straight, his movements measured, the kind of presence that did not demand attention yet commanded it effortlessly. And for a fraction of a second, Olivia did not recognize him, because everything about him now contradicted the image she had already placed in her mind. And then he lifted his head, his eyes scanning the room, calm, precise, and when they reached her, the world seemed to narrow to a single, undeniable realization. It was him, the man from the entrance, the one she had dismissed, the one she had reduced to a problem to be handled. And the recognition hit her not like a shock, but like a quiet, irreversible shift, something falling into place too late to be undone. And she felt her breath catch just slightly, though her posture did not change, her expression still composed, still controlled, because years of discipline held firm even as something inside her fractured. And the man continued forward, taking his place at the head of the table, setting down a thin folder with deliberate ease, his voice steady as he spoke. "Good afternoon." And the tone was the same as before, calm, measured, but now layered with authority that filled the room without needing to rise. "For those of you who have not met me, my name is Nathan Blake." A brief pause, just long enough for the name to settle, to ripple through the awareness of everyone present. "I am the chief executive officer of this company." And there it was, spoken plainly, without emphasis, without theatrics, yet it landed with a weight that no one could ignore. And around the table, subtle reactions unfolded, a shift in posture, a glance exchanged, a quiet intake of breath. But Olivia heard none of it, because her focus had locked entirely on him, on the way he stood, on the way his presence filled the space in a way it never had outside. Or perhaps it had, and she simply had not seen it. And her mind moved quickly, assembling the pieces she had dismissed, the way he had observed, the way he had spoken, the question he had asked her that morning. And suddenly, none of it felt random, none of it felt accidental. It felt intentional, deliberate, as if she had been part of something she had not even realized was happening. And Nathan's gaze moved across the room, acknowledging each department head in turn. But when it returned to her, It held for just a fraction longer, not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough for her to feel it, to understand that he remembered, that he had not forgotten a single word, and a quiet tension settled in her chest. Not panic, not yet, but something close, something she had not felt in a very long time. Because for the first time in years, Olivia Hayes was no longer the one evaluating, no longer the one in control, and as Nathan opened the folder in front of him, his voice continuing, outlining the purpose of the audit, the importance of transparency, the expectation of accountability, she realized with a clarity that left no room for denial, that whatever was about to unfold in that room, it would not just be about performance metrics or departmental efficiency. It would be about something deeper, something personal, something she had unknowingly set into motion the moment she chose to look away. The room remained silent even after Nathan Blake finished outlining the structure of the audit, as if no one was entirely sure whether to move, to speak, or simply to breathe normally again. And Olivia Hayes sat there with her hands lightly clasped on the table, her posture still composed, still precise. But inside, something had shifted in a way she could not immediately correct, because the man she had dismissed twice, the man she had reduced to an inconvenience, was now standing at the center of the room holding complete authority over every decision that would follow. And that realization settled into her with a slow, undeniable weight, not explosive, not chaotic, but steady, like a truth that refused to be ignored. And Nathan's voice continued, calm and deliberate, as he moved from general expectations into specifics, calling on department heads one by one, asking questions that were not aggressive, yet somehow more penetrating than any direct confrontation, because he did not rush, he did not interrupt, he simply listened, and when he responded, it was with clarity that left no room for deflection. And Olivia watched this unfold with careful attention, her mind shifting back into analysis, because that was what she knew how to do. She observed patterns, she read people, she anticipated outcomes. And yet there was something about the way he conducted himself that did not align with her expectations, because this was not someone trying to assert dominance. This was someone measuring something deeper, something beyond performance. And when his gaze finally returned to her, there was no announcement, no dramatic pause, just a simple, direct acknowledgement, Ms. Hayes, and the sound of her name in his voice carried a quiet familiarity that only she could recognize, and she straightened slightly, meeting his gaze without hesitation, because whatever this was, she would not allow herself to falter in front of others. Your department, he continued, handles hiring, evaluation, and termination across all divisions, correct? Yes, she replied, her tone steady, professional, exactly as expected. We ensure alignment with company standards and long-term performance goals. Nathan nodded once, as if confirming something already known. And those standards, he said, his voice even. How do you define them? It was a simple question, one she had answered countless times in different forms. And yet something about the way he asked it made it feel less like a routine inquiry and more like a test with no obvious correct answer. And Olivia chose her words carefully. Standards are based on accountability, consistency, and measurable contribution, she said, her voice clear, controlled. We prioritize individuals who demonstrate discipline, reliability, and the ability to adapt under pressure. There was a brief pause, not long, but enough to register, and Nathan held her gaze, not challenging, not approving, simply considering. And what about circumstances? He asked quietly. Factors outside of measurable performance. Olivia felt a subtle tightening in her chest, because the question echoed something uncomfortably familiar, something from earlier that day, and she maintained her composure, though her response came just a fraction slower. Circumstances are considered when relevant, she said. But ultimately, performance determines outcome. Nathan inclined his head slightly, as if acknowledging the answer, but his eyes did not leave hers. So if someone fails to meet expectations, he continued, regardless of their situation, your conclusion remains the same. And there. It was not an accusation, not directly, but a line drawn clearly enough that she could see where it led. And for a moment, the room seemed to narrow again, the quiet presence of everyone else fading into the background as Olivia held that gaze. aware now that this was no longer just a discussion about policy. This was something personal, something precise, something that had been building long before this meeting began. And she felt the weight of her own words, the certainty she had always relied on, now standing in front of her in a different light. And yet she did not look away. She did not retreat, because that was not who she was. Yes, she said finally, her voice firm, even as something deeper shifted beneath it. The conclusion remains the same. And Nathan studied her for a moment longer, then gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, as if a piece of a larger picture had just fallen into place. And as he moved on to the next topic, the conversation continuing as though nothing unusual had happened, Olivia realized that whatever this audit truly was, it had already begun for her long before she ever sat down in that room, and now there was no way to step outside of it. The meeting continued, voices rising and falling in controlled intervals as each department head presented their reports. But for Olivia Hayes, the words had begun to blur into something distant, something secondary to the quiet pressure building beneath the surface of her thoughts, because she could still feel it, the weight of Nathan Blake's gaze earlier, the precision of his questions, the way he had not challenged her directly, yet had somehow forced her to hear her own answers differently. And she did not like that, not because she doubted her decisions, but because for the first time, she could not fully dismiss the possibility that something in her logic had been incomplete, and that uncertainty lingered as the meeting finally came to an end. Chairs shifting, low conversations beginning again as people gathered their things, but Olivia remained seated for a moment longer, her hands resting lightly on the table, her eyes fixed on the surface as if she could find clarity in the reflection there, until a quiet voice broke through her thoughts, "Ms. Hayes." And she looked up to find Nathan standing beside her, not across the room now, not behind the authority of distance, but close enough that she could see the finer details she had missed before, the calm steadiness in his expression, the absence of any visible judgment, which somehow made the situation more difficult, not less, and she stood immediately, instinctively matching his presence with her own composure. "Mr. Blake," she replied, her tone professional, controlled, though something beneath it had shifted, something less certain than before. "Do you have a moment?" he asked, and the simplicity of the question contrasted sharply with the weight it carried, because she knew this was no longer part of the formal meeting. This was something else entirely, and she nodded, of course, following him as he stepped away from the table toward the floor-to-ceiling windows at the far end of the room, the city, stretching out beyond the glass, gray and distant, a reminder of everything that existed outside the controlled environment she relied on. And for a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence settling in a way that felt intentional, as if he were allowing space for something unspoken to surface. And Olivia held her posture, waiting, unwilling to fill that silence first, because she needed to understand where this was going before she revealed anything more than necessary. And finally, Nathan turned slightly, his gaze meeting hers again. "You are very certain in your decisions," he said, not as an accusation, not even as a question, just a statement, and Olivia inclined her head slightly. "Certainty is necessary in my role," she replied, her voice steady. "People rely on clear outcomes." Nathan nodded once, as if acknowledging the truth in that, but his eyes did not shift. "And when those outcomes affect someone who is already struggling?" he asked quietly, and there it was again. The same line of thought, the same quiet challenge, and Olivia felt that subtle tension return, because she understood now that this was not theoretical, this was not abstract policy, this was about something he had seen, something he had experienced directly, and she chose her words carefully. "Difficult circumstances do not change the need for standards," she said, though the conviction in her voice felt slightly thinner than before. "If exceptions are made too easily, the system becomes unstable." Nathan studied her for a moment, his expression unchanged, but there was a depth in his gaze that made it clear he was listening beyond the words themselves. "Do you believe that stability is always the same as fairness?" he asked, and the question landed differently this time. Not sharp, not confrontational, but quietly persistent, and Olivia hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, because the answer she had always relied on no longer felt as immediate as it once had. And in that brief pause, Something inside her shifted again, something she could not fully define, but could no longer ignore. And Nathan seemed to register it, not with satisfaction, not with approval, just with recognition. And he gave a small nod, as if marking that moment without needing to say more. "Thank you for your time, Ms. Hayes," he said, stepping back slightly. The conversation ending as simply as it had begun, but leaving behind something far more complicated than any formal review. And as he turned to leave, Olivia remained where she was, her reflection faint in the glass beside her, the city beyond stretching endlessly outward. And for the first time in years, she was not thinking about control, or outcomes, or performance. She was thinking about a question she could no longer answer with certainty, and that realization lingered long after he had walked away. That night, the city did not feel the same to Olivia Hayes. Even though nothing had visibly changed, the streets still alive with movement, headlights stretching into long reflections across damp asphalt, the distant hum of traffic blending into the background like it always had. And yet as she walked out of Blake Industries, her steps slower than usual, there was a quiet weight following her, not heavy enough to stop her, but persistent enough that she could not ignore it, and without thinking, her eyes drifted toward the edge of the building's entrance, toward the place where she had first seen him, where she had dismissed him without a second thought. And for a moment, it was empty, just shadows and cold air settling in where the day's energy had faded, and she almost turned away, almost continued forward as she had every other time. But then she noticed a small detail she had not seen before, a paper cup resting near the wall, slightly crumpled, forgotten, or maybe left behind, and something about it caught her attention, not because it was unusual, but because it was ordinary, and she stepped closer without fully realizing why, her heels quieter now against the pavement, and when she reached it, she hesitated before bending down slightly, her fingers brushing the edge of the cup as she turned it, revealing a faint logo from a nearby coffee shop, one she passed every morning, one she had stopped at countless times without ever thinking about the people around her. And a memory surfaced, subtle but clear, the way he had said he was not asking for money, just a moment of her time. And she straightened slowly, the cup still in her hand, and for the first time, the moment replayed differently in her mind, not as an interruption, not as something beneath her attention, but as something she had chosen to dismiss without understanding. And she exhaled quietly, her gaze lifting toward the street ahead. And she realized that what unsettled her was not the fact that he had been her CEO, not the authority he held, but the simplicity of what he had asked, and how easily she had refused it. And as she stood there, the noise of the city moving around her, she became aware of something else, a subtle shift in her own perspective, something small but undeniable. Because for years she had believed that control meant strength, that certainty meant fairness, that maintaining distance was the only way to protect what she had built. And now, for the first time, she could see the edges of that belief, the places where it might not hold as firmly as she once thought. And she did not know what to do with that yet, did not know how to adjust or respond. But she knew she could not simply return to the version of herself that had walked past this exact spot without a second glance. And as she turned to leave, the cup still in her hand, she hesitated again, then crossed the street toward the coffee shop, the warm light inside spilling out onto the sidewalk. And a few minutes later, she stepped back out, holding a fresh cup, the heat seeping through the lid into her fingers, grounding her in a way she had not expected. And she looked once more toward the empty space beneath the overhang, knowing he was not there, knowing this was not about him being present, but about something she had missed when he was. And she placed the cup gently on the ledge where he had stood, not as a gesture for recognition, not as a performance, but as something quieter, something she was not entirely ready to define. And as she stepped back, her expression still composed but softer in a way only she would notice, she realized that whatever this audit was meant to reveal, it was no longer just about the company. It was about her, and for the first time, she was willing to see that. The next morning arrived quieter than the days before, as if the city itself had softened its edges just slightly. And Olivia Hayes stood across the street from Blake Industries, her gaze fixed on the entrance before she had even fully decided why she had come early. The cup she had left the night before still faintly visible on the ledge beneath the overhang, untouched, exactly where she had placed it. And something about that stirred a quiet sense of clarity within her, not because she expected anything to happen, but because for the first time, her actions were not driven by expectation at all. And as she crossed the street, her steps slower, more deliberate, she noticed him before she reached the doors, not standing under the overhang this time, but a few feet away, leaning slightly against the building, dressed once again in simple, worn clothes, as if the version of him from the boardroom had never existed. And for a brief moment, she hesitated, the contrast between the two realities still settling into place. But then she continued forward, stopping a few feet in front of him, and he looked up, his expression calm, steady, the same quiet awareness in his eyes, and neither of them spoke immediately, the silence between them no longer uncomfortable, but reflective, as if both understood that something had already shifted. "You left it there," he said finally, his voice even, nodding slightly toward the cup on the ledge, and Olivia followed his gaze before looking back at him. "I was not sure if you would come back," she replied, her tone softer than it had been before, not uncertain, but no longer guarded in the same way. And he studied her for a moment, not as an executive evaluating an employee, but as someone recognizing a change that had not been forced. "And if I did not?" he asked quietly, and Olivia paused, just long enough to consider the question honestly. "Then it would still matter that I left it," she said, and there was no defensiveness in her voice. Only a simple acknowledgement of something she had begun to understand, and Nathan nodded slightly, as if that answer aligned with something he had been waiting to see, and for a moment, the distance between them felt smaller, not in position, but in perspective, and Olivia took a small breath, her gaze steady on his. "You were not testing policies," she said, more a realization than a question. "You were testing people." Nathan did not respond immediately, his eyes holding hers, calm, thoughtful, before he finally spoke. "Policies tell me how a company functions," he said. "People tell me what it stands for." And the words settled between them, quiet but undeniable, and Olivia felt the weight of them, not as criticism, but as truth. And for the first time, she did not resist it, did not try to reshape it into something more comfortable. She simply accepted it, and that acceptance changed something fundamental, something she had held onto for years without question. And as the morning light shifted slightly across the building's glass surface, reflecting both of them side by side, she realized that the difference between them had never been about status or position or authority. It had been about perspective, about what they chose to see and what they chose to ignore. And Nathan straightened slightly, his posture shifting just enough to signal the return of the role he carried. Though the distance between them did not fully return with it. "There will be changes," he said, his tone calm, direct, not just in structure, but in approach. Olivia nodded once, not in agreement alone, but in understanding, because she knew now that those changes would not come from policy updates or performance metrics alone. They would come from decisions made differently, from moments handled with awareness instead of assumption. And as he turned to leave, stepping toward the entrance, he paused briefly, glancing back at her. "You have the ability to lead that change," he added, not as a command, but as an opportunity. And Olivia watched him go, the glass doors closing behind him, reflecting her image once more. But this time, it was not the same reflection she had seen before, not as rigid, not as distant. And as she turned to follow, her steps steady, her posture still strong but no longer guarded in the same way, she understood that what had begun as a test had become something more, something she would carry forward, not because she had been told to change, but because she had finally chosen to see. And in that choice, everything else began to follow.